The period leading up to Ho's Declaration of Independence in 1945, as we've just seen, is incredibly hectic and chaotic. So if everything I said just seemed like a mile a minute, it really was, and don't worry about it. You know, do the readings, which will really help fill in a lot of the empty spots. But just know going in, it's incredibly complex and chaotic. And you know, the more I study it, it's really amazes me that the Viet Minh were able to kind of, you know, make their way safely through this passage, because at any given time the French or the Japanese or famine or whatever could have destroyed them and didn't. And so, you know, Ho survives, and on September 2nd, 1945, in Ba Dinh Square in Hanoi, gives the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence. Now, on the podium with him are American OSS agents, and in fact, he checked the translation of the speech with OSS agents ahead of time. In his talk, which is in the reader, he proclaims the independence of Vietnam with words which he lifted directly from another document with which you're all familiar, you should be, the American Declaration of Independence. He said, "The Creator has given us certain inviolable rights, the right to life, the right to be free, and the right to achieve happiness," life, liberty, and happiness. Ho went on, "These immortal words are taken from the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America in 1776. In a larger sense, this means that all the people on earth are born equal. All the people have the right to live, to be happy, to be free." And he went on very closely following the script of the American Declaration of Independence, and he finished, "Vietnam has the right to be a free and independent country, and in fact, it is so already." Well, that wasn't really the case. Vietnam, although Ho proclaimed independence, would not become an independent country for nearly another 30 years. Ho Chi Minh's dream, which he thought was finally realized at the end of World War II, after the Japanese were defeated and the French were weakened and he proclaimed independence, would not be the case. Okay? Ho Chi Minh, however, sets out and he begins to conduct policies as if he were the president of a newly unified country. The first thing he has to do is deal with the aftershocks of the war and the famine. The famine, as we said, may have killed as many as 2 million people in 1944 and 45. What does Ho Chi Minh do? Actually, he institutes something of an austerity program. It's kind of ironic. It's something the IMF might do today. Ho institutes new taxes. He calls on people who are already starving to fast because there's not enough food. Intensifies cultivation. Puts a ban on the distillation of liquor because he figures grain should be used for food rather than for drink. So it's an austerity package. So Ho Chi Minh does not get off, hit the ground running with this radical redistribution of wealth or anything like that. He basically has to deal with the famine first. But the bigger problem Ho has to deal with is going to be political. The French refuse to recognize Viet Minh independence. France is not willing to concede that its days in Indochina might be numbered or that it has assumed the mantle of the loser in Indochina. The French don't recognize that, and they decide that Indochina is still theirs. Why does France do this? In some measure, there are economic interests there, rubber plantations and so forth, but I think just as importantly, it was a matter of what we can call, a term we can use, credibility. We'll talk a lot about this later, especially with regard to John F. Kennedy. It's something I'll mention from time to time. The French deemed themselves a great power. France deemed itself a great power, and especially now, after World War II, Charles de Gaulle takes over, who had led the resistance. You know, France was a great power, but it had crumbled. I mean, within 6 weeks, the Nazis had come in and taken over. They'd established this puppet regime at Vichy, which had done all kinds of terrible things. It had shipped Jews out to the concentration camps, and so forth. It had, been crushed by the Japanese in Indochina. And so to reclaim its status as a power, to be credible, to have other countries respect and maybe fear and treat France as an equal, you have to reassert your credibility. And you don't become credible by allowing colonials, especially non-white colonials, to leave the empire. Yeah.
And you said this was more important than economic reasons?
I think it might have been. I mean, France, even though it has interest in Vietnam, basically isn't going to lose them. I mean, one thing that Ho has been clear on is that France can retain its concessions. The Vietnamese don't have a developed infrastructure of their own, so they kind of need foreign capital. So France doesn't, I think, face a real prospect of being kicked out. You know, I mean, I don't think it's going to be, you know, like in Cuba in 1959, the foreigners left. They were compensated and they were kicked out. They were offered compensation, they were kicked out. That doesn't seem to be a prospect. I mean, I think the French are afraid of that, especially with regard to the rubber plantations. But I think it's even more than that. It's this idea of credibility. I mean, how can we, you know, France has other colonies, Algeria especially. How can we retain Algeria if we lose Indochina? How can we be a great power if we lose Indochina? I mean, World War II is a huge blow to France internationally. And losing colonies on top of that is going to add to its problems. Okay? Now, during World War II, there was a lot of rhetoric, anti-colonial rhetoric. It's time for the colonies of the world to be given their independence. But there's a great deal of question as to how much people like FDR and Truman really believe that. I mean, obviously Churchill wasn't a believer in that. But there's a real question as to how much, I mean, FDR and Truman may have believed that rhetorically. They may have advocated decolonization rhetorically. But in real terms, it's not clear that they were really all that serious about it. And the French certainly don't fear any kind of American retribution, so they refuse to recognize Viet Minh independence. And so the French essentially begin negotiating with Ho Chi Minh for a return to Vietnam. Now, why should Ho negotiate? Because he's not dealing from a position of strength. The Viet Minh, I mean, Vietnam itself is in disarray. 2 million people are dead from a famine, a massive war, Japanese occupation. The Viet Minh, you know, although clearly a competent military force with some great command, not an army that people would normally fear. The French, obviously, technologically superior. France, remember, got out of World War II pretty easily. I mean, of all the major powers, who suffered less than the French? They were occupied and essentially sat it out. So France, clearly in the power equation, dominates the Viet Minh. So Ho is really in a position of weakness, and so he begins negotiating first with General Jean Leclerc, who's the High Commissioner for Indochina. It's a term you'll see time and again, Leclerc. My handwriting is worse all the time. No wonder the nuns used to rap me on the hands, right? And Leclerc actually wants to get the Viet Minh situation out of the hand. And Leclerc, in fact, is willing to put the idea of independence on the table. Ho Chi Minh, for his part, is willing to compromise as well. He is willing to accept a kind of a transitional membership in the French Union before independence. Now, this is consistent. Remember, earlier Ho said independence not less than 5 years, not more than 10. I mean, Giap and Trong Chin and Pham Van Dong and others are saying immediate, demanding immediate independence. Ho Chi Minh, even though he's declared on September 2nd, 1945, by all rights, he's in charge of the country, is still willing to negotiate some kind of an arrangement with the French. And you can well imagine he's catching hell from a lot of his comrades in the movement who are accusing him of selling out, of being a traitor. But Ho Chi Minh understood again that he's dealing not from a position of strength. Only the Vietnamese recognized their own independence in 1945. Not even the Soviet Union recognized Ho Chi Minh until 1950. So Ho really is isolated internationally. Vietnam considers itself a country, but no one else does. In addition to that, all kinds of weird occupation politics begin to come into play. Once the war is over, the British and the Chinese are given occupational responsibilities. Okay, and now you get to see this exact replica of Vietnam. It's a perfect map of it, right? All right. Now, in the South, the British Army is given occupational duties, and in the North, the Chinese, Chiang Kai-shek, the Kuomintang. All right. The British in the South take their time in disarming the Japanese, and actually I'll tell you some more about that later. And in fact, the British, with some French POWs and some Indian troops of their own, India's a British colony, actually have a coup against the Viet Minh Committee, which was in charge of Saigon. So the British start hassling the Viet Minh. In addition to that, in the U.S., which we'll talk about later, there's really no thought given to telling France to stay out of Vietnam. So in the South, at least, the British are somewhat emboldened. Ultimately, the British will leave, and the French will come back in. All right? In the North, the Chinese aren't terribly concerned with Indochina. What is Zhang Jieshi? What is the Kuomintang's biggest concern in 1945? What's the major issue in China in 1945? The Civil War, right? So Zhang doesn't want his troops in northern Indochina. He wants them back in China to fight against Mao, right? So the Chinese ultimately will leave. Now, in the north, in Tonkin, this has traditionally been the seat of rebellion. The French will establish, kind of a authority in name only. And in the north, Ho Chi Minh essentially will remain in charge, and there he will create something called the DRVN, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. But France essentially returns to power in Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh, again, understands his weaknesses. He begins negotiating with the French, and in March of 1946 comes to an agreement at Fontainebleau Palace called the Fontainebleau Agreement. The top picture is Ho with Leclerc and Jean Santenay, French representative at the talks. And this is Ho in 1946. If you have a web at home, you can get the full thing there, giving a speech, a talk about the negotiations at Fontainebleau. Okay. So Ho has a very good working relationship, actually, with the French. And in March of 1946, they come to a deal. They come to an agreement, the Fontainebleau Agreement. It was the meetings were held in Fontainebleau Hotel, I think. And those agreements said that the French should recognize Vietnam as a free state, having its own government, its own parliament, its own finances, but forming part of the Indo-Chinese Federation and the French Union. It's not independence. Okay, so the best Ho can do is that Vietnam is a free state, whatever that means, but it's also still part of the French Union and the Indo-Chinese Federation. It is still French Indochina. Ho Chi Minh said he would welcome in the French army when it replaces the KMT in the north and the British in the south. Ho Chi Minh says he wants to open frank and friendly negotiations over the future of Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh is accused of being a sellout, a traitor. Why? Why is he doing this? Because Ho Chi Minh's number one enemy in Asia is, go with me on this one, China. Exactly. And Ho Chi Minh is berated as a sellout, a traitor, a puppet, or a hostage. But Ho says to his comrades who are telling him not to let the French back in, "You fools! Don't you realize what it means if the Chinese stay? Don't you remember your history? The last time the Chinese came, they stayed for 1,000 years. The French are foreigners. They're weak. Colonialism is dying out. Nothing will be able to withstand world pressure for independence. They may stay a while, but they'll have to go because the white man is finished in Asia. But if the Chinese stay now, they'll never leave. As for me, I prefer to smell French shit for 5 years rather than eat Chinese shit for the rest of my life." His rather earthy explanation of why he's willing to negotiate with the French rather than deal with the Chinese. And again, a lot of his comrades did not want to deal with that, but in fact, Ho, understandably has history on his side. So he's berated as a sellout and whatnot. In fact, in a Vietnamese journal, there's a letter from Vietnamese immigrants called An Open Letter to Comrade Nguyen Ai Quoc. They're not calling him Ho Chi Minh now. And they say, "We are the remnants of the handful of men trained by you in 1925. Your ideas made a deep impression on us. We saw you as a symbol of all the young workers in Vietnam. Little did we suspect that we should have to renounce all hope after March 8th, the day of the Fontainebleau Agreement. You have signed an agreement to accept self-government, not independence. The strength of our faith in you in the days when your name stood for the great revolutionary idea is equaled today by the rage in our hearts. We are ashamed we should have chosen you, the wrong elder. But the Vietnamese people never lose hope for long. They will continue along the path which you have been unable to follow to the end. So this is fairly serious stuff. Ho Chi Minh is being accused of a sellout, being a traitor to his people. And making matters worse, the French double deal against Ho. And on June 1st, the High Commissioner in Cochinchina, Admiral Terry d'Argenlot, proclaimed that Cochinchina, the southern third, was a free state on its own with a government, a parliament, an army, and a finances. So this gives even more ammunition to these radicals who were attacking Ho Chi Minh as a sellout, because the French on June 1st, not even 3 months after the agreement, said, well, actually Cochinchina, the southern part, which is where they've always been stronger anyway, this is a free state on its own. Now, this is not what Ho agreed to. It wasn't, he wasn't dividing Vietnam into the three traditional sections. He was seeing Vietnam as a unified, independent country. And now the French are saying, well, the Cochin Chinese are different. So Ho Chi Minh gets even more flack after that. See, you trusted these people, and they immediately turn on you. Ho at that point broke off talks with the French. And in fact, that picture we saw of him giving a talk is the talk he gave as he boarded the ship back for Vietnam. Okay? Ho Chi Minh was willing to make concessions about independence, about how long it would take to be independent. He would not concede territory. And that's what this agreement did. It was trying to cut Vietnam into the traditional thirds, and Ho Chi Minh was only willing to see Vietnam as a unified single entity. And this is going to be the way it is throughout, right? So Ho Chi Minh breaks off talks in June of '46. Later that fall, they resume, and he reaches a new deal in September of 1946, which was very similar to the March Agreement. It safeguarded French interests. It was not a radical document by any means. And it said that hostility should end in the South. However, the French, despite this agreement, continued skirmishing with the Viet Minh. Remember, as I said, the British helped disarm the Viet Minh in Saigon. And throughout the countryside, French and Viet Minh forces are skirmishing with each other. The Viet Minh have not disarmed, and clearly the French are back in tow. So things are clearly edgy. There's a lot of angst going around. And this will lead to a fairly major confrontation very shortly. In November of 1946, the French opened a charnel house in Haiphong. Ho Chi Minh protested it, but before this issue could be resolved, Viet Minh forces in the north at a place called Long Son, which is near Haiphong. Haiphong is up here in the north. Okay, Viet Minh forces begin at first harassing the French, and then they fire on a French ship. The French ordered all Viet Minh troops removed from Haiphong, which was a clear violation of Fontainebleau. Fontainebleau did not give the French the right to kick the Viet Minh out of any area. Okay? General Jean Valois, from the French commander, said to Ho, to the Vietnamese, in the face of premeditated aggression, he's accusing the Viet Minh of aggression, premeditated aggression, your honorable attempts of conciliation are no longer appropriate. The time has come to give a harsh lesson to those who have treacherously attacked us. By every means at your disposal, you must take, this is his orders, by every means at your disposal, you must take control of Haiphong and bring the government and the Vietnamese army to repentance. The commander at Haiphong was a Colonel De Bay, who hated the Viets. He called them the Viets. He hated them. He ordered an immediate evacuation of Haiphong, and the Vietnamese refused. The Viet Minh refused to leave. De Bay had no authority to oust the Viet Minh from Haiphong. 3 hours after the order was given, the Viet Minh were still there. De Bay and the French opened fire. They met resistance. The Viet Minh fired back, so the French called on naval artillery support. Paul Moose, who's a French anthropologist who knows Vietnam as well as anybody, not prone to hyperbole, estimated that the French in that single day killed 6,000 Vietnamese at Haiphong. Hanoi, the capital of the North, Ho Chi Minh, the Viet Minh, declared the Fontainebleau Agreements null and void. The Viet Minh and the French began retaliating. The war essentially had begun. This is more or less the outbreak of what would later be known as the First Indochina War. Jobs forces, Von Nguyen Jobs forces grouped in the north, and the French were preparing for a major battle. Ho Chi Minh gives an address to the people of Vietnam. Compatriots all over the country, as we desired peace, we made concessions, but the more we made concessions, the further the French colonialists went, because they're resolved to invade our country once again. No, we would rather sacrifice all than lose our country. We are determined not to be enslaved. Men and women, old and young, regardless of creeds, political parties, or nationalities, all the Vietnamese must stand up to fight the French colonialists to save the fatherland. Those who have rifles will use their rifles. Those who have swords will use their swords. Those who have no swords will use spades, hoes, or sticks. Everyone must endeavor to oppose the colonialist and save his country. Even if we have to endure hardship in the resistance war, with the determination to make sacrifices, victory will surely be ours. He gave another talk on the radio the next day where he addressed the people of France and the world in general. French people, we have affection for you, and we sincerely want to cooperate with you within the framework of the French Union, because we have a common ideal, which is freedom, equality, and independence. Peoples of the Allied powers, the French reactionaries are waging an aggressive war in Vietnam. The Vietnamese people ask you to intervene. This is something Ho will do time and again in the 60s. He will address the people of the United States. He will send telegrams to anti-war rallies. And he will ask the people of the rest of the world, including France, so the tables will be turned, to intervene on behalf of the Vietnamese against the United States. By 1946, Von Nguyen Giap has begun fighting on all fronts. The French army is engaged in full-scale warfare. Ho Chi Minh understands now that he can no longer go slow, take his time. He is engaged now in a war for independence against the French, the hated French, who he thought he had been defeated. Ho gives an interview in 1946 to a journalist, and he explains how things are going to work out. He says, if ever the tiger pauses, the elephant will impale him on his mighty tusks. Who's the elephant? Who's the tiger in this parable? The French are the elephants and the Vietnamese are the tigers. If ever the tiger pauses, the elephant will impale him on his mighty tusks. But the tiger will not pause, and the elephant will die of exhaustion and loss of blood. Again, protracted war, patience. Ho Chi Minh, talking to a French socialist minister, says, you'll kill 10 of my men for every one I kill of yours. But even at that rate, you'll be unable to hold out, and victory will go to me. Okay. Ho Chi Minh was hoping to avert war even as late as January 1947, even though he realizes that it's unlikely. In a last-ditch effort, he sends a letter to Jean Santenay, who he developed a good relationship with. He says, dear friend, I've just learned that you're about to return to France. I send you and Madame Santenay my wishes for a good journey and good health. I am sure that you, like me, are profoundly sorry that our mutual efforts for peace should be destroyed by this fratricidal war. Fratricide, brothers. I mean, he sees the French and the Viet Minh as being part of the same family. I know you well enough to say this. You are not to blame for this policy of force and reconquest. That is why I am anxious to tell you again that, despite what has happened, the Haiphong attack, you and I are still friends. And I can assure you that our two people are still friends too. We have already had enough of death and destruction. What are we to do now, you and I? France has only to recognize the independence and unity of Vietnam, and at once hostilities will cease. Peace and trust will return. And we shall be able to get down to work and start rebuilding for the common good of our two countries. For my part, I am ready to work for peace, a just and honorable peace for our two countries. I hope that you, on your side, will be working toward the same goal. May God grant us success, your devoted Ho Chi Minh. So even at this late in the game, Ho Chi Minh, even though war has broken out, is still trying to find some kind of an accommodation to avoid warfare. However, that's not likely. Inside France, those who might argue for a peaceful settlement or for accommodation are sacked. By the late 1940s, we'll talk about the Cold War later, but the Cold War is, you know, at its fever pitch, and anyone talking about negotiations or getting along with somebody who's a communist is not going to have much credibility. And the French left essentially buys into it too. The French left, most of the lefts become anti-communist lefts, except for the communist parties and some of the trade unions. So the French left really doesn't defend Ho Chi Minh. And when the French make overtures to Ho, they demand things that Ho would never accept. They want the Viet Minh to disarm totally, to hand over all their weapons. It's never going to happen. They want the French to be given freedom of movement throughout Vietnam. Free movement. French troops are supposed to be allowed free movement. In fact, before the NATO war against Kosovo, the Fontainebleau Agreement, which Milosevic rejected, would have given NATO troops free movement throughout Yugoslavia. That gutted it. No one is going to accept another power having access to your entire country. It wanted to force the Viet Minh disarmed to only be allowed in certain areas as well, and it wanted the Vietnamese to deliver all non-Vietnamese into French hands. Now, the Vietnamese, of course, would never accept that, and so they rejected it, and the war begins in earnest in 1946. This is what will eventually be called the First Indochina War. Okay? We're going to move across the Pacific and start talking about the United States now. Does anybody have any questions on this, though? We've kind of gone up to the start of the First Indochina War. Okay, we're going to start talking about America now. We'll spend the rest of the time doing that. And I just want to give you a general background on American foreign policy, on U.S. foreign policy. I think it's useful to see not only Vietnam over the French call it la longue durée, the long period, and we talked about Vietnam from the second or third millennia BC to the present. But I want to talk about the United States too, and obviously the U.S. history is much shorter than Vietnam's, but I think it's still useful to put the American war against Vietnam within the context of America's larger history of foreign policy. And so I want to talk about that. The Americans find Vietnam basically just they didn't know anything about Vietnam prior to World War II. And we'll give a little background on that. All right? And I want to start by just talking about these four concepts very briefly. And these ideas kind of drive American foreign policy. And I think they all come into play at various times in the Vietnam War as well. And you can put them in, if you choose to put them in a different order, that's fine. They're all interrelated. One of the key components, I would argue, that the major factor behind American foreign policy is the idea of expansion, especially in pursuit of markets. The United States has been an expansive country from the beginning. I mean, even before the War for Independence against the British, the United States was trying to grow, to move. You see this in the attacks on Indians and so forth, the French and Indian Wars, and there's always this pursuit of markets too. The need to find new areas for trade, for investment, markets for consumers, markets for labor, and so forth. Now, you can look at a specific incident like the Vietnam War, and you may not see a very detailed or specific economic influence, but the overall or general desire for expansion of markets often is really there. Even though it may be subtle, it may not be spoken, it's always going to be a driving force. We'll talk about that specifically with regard to Vietnam. I know in the email exchanges we've had, which are quite good, some people, last week's question was, why did the U.S. get involved in this area, which didn't seem very important, and some people saying economic reasons, others saying anti-communism, and so forth. Later on, I'm going to make something of an economic argument for it, but not a specific one. Rubber, tin, tungsten, they were valuable, but they weren't crucial. But I think that there were other factors, economic factors, which made Vietnam important. I don't want to get too far ahead of the game yet. So sometimes an economic influence doesn't have to be something specific. It doesn't necessarily mean we have investments here, or we need your oil, or we need this or that. It can mean something more opaque, but equally important. So one aspect of American foreign policy then is going to be this search for expansion, this expansive mode, this search for markets, for investment, for production and consumers and so forth. Another aspect of it, and again, all of these are going to be, I think, prevalent in the Vietnam era. Another aspect of it is ideology. By ideology, I mean not just the way people think, but the entire culture, the milieu in which they operate. And a big aspect of ideology is going to be this capitalist expansion. American ideology, by the time that it gets deeply involved in Vietnam, is going to be liberal capitalist. And liberal, in the classic 20th century sense, doesn't mean what people would caricature it as today. Conservatives today kind of, liberals are people who want to tax you and take your money away and give it to minorities and give people money who don't want to work and so forth. Liberal capitalism is actually an economic philosophy. And liberalism actually doesn't have anything to do with government handouts or anything like that. It basically means free trade, an open world with no barriers to trade, with equal access to markets, and so on. And American ideology is a liberal ideology in the 20th century. It's a liberal capitalist ideology until fairly recently. Right? And so that's going to be important in the Vietnam era as well. And that's important as a characteristic of American foreign policy writ large. There's also a sense of mission. The United States believes that it has found kind of the ideal way to live and to operate and to organize its society and to organize its foreign affairs. And it wants to bring that missionary aspect, that missionary zeal to other societies as well. There's a religious component to this. We want to Christianize our poor brown brethren, or these people aren't civilized, they're kind of barbaric, they're aboriginal. We want to bring, it's our mission. Rudyard Kipling called it the white man's burden. The U.S. doesn't really use that term, although time and again you'll see kind of, implications very similar to that. So there's this missionary aspect to it as well. We need to bring the blessings of American life to Vietnam, and especially in things when we talk about like the pacification program, winning their hearts and minds. This is going to be an attempt to create these American cultural values in this Asian country with the history that's exponentially longer than America's is. Okay? At one point, Lyndon Johnson wants to create a TVA, a Tennessee Valley Authority project for the Mekong Delta. I mean, he thinks that you can be like a ward healer, a politician, and just take this TVA thing and put it in Vietnam. All right? And it's this sense of mission, And finally, there's this idea of hegemony or empire. You often get in trouble when you use the term empire to describe the United States. It's a squirrely term. And clearly, the British have an empire, the French have an empire, the Germans have empires. The United States never had an empire per se. I mean, it colonized the Philippines, and Puerto Rico's a commonwealth, Saipan's a commonwealth, Guam and whatnot, but never a formal empire per se. But I would argue that its hegemony economically constitutes an informal empire of free trade and investment. Right? And by hegemony, hegemony refers to power, to control. And clearly after World War II, especially from World War I on, but especially after World War II, the United States has global hegemony. It is the most powerful country in the world, has been, still is, for over 50 years now. And this sense of hegemony, this sense of free trade imperialism, really characterizes the way the U.S. looks at the rest of the world, especially the third world. It can be very emboldening, very expansive. It can create a sense of arrogance if taken too far. And I think the Vietnamese would argue that that was clearly the case. Right? So all of these characteristics, I think, are going to come into play. And you see them from the beginning. The United States has always had an expansive ideology. I mean, quite often textbooks and whatnot start, they talk about 1898 as kind of the origins of American imperialism, the new empire, when the United States fights against the Spanish in Cuba and the Philippines and takes over Hawaii and whatnot. But actually, this goes back, to the beginning, to the origins of the settlements in North America. I mean, the United States has always been expansive. It has always moved out. From the very first, Indian removal has been a key characteristic of American foreign policy. And this ties into several of those. Expansion and mission, for example. The Indians are different. They don't exploit land the way Europeans do. They don't own land. They don't put a property, a fence around it with a mailbox and a Starbucks or anything like that. They have land in common. And the Europeans don't understand that. I mean, they want that land for agricultural reasons, for production, and the Indians aren't really making use of it anyway. So Indian removal becomes kind of the first characteristic of American expansionism. And some of the icons of American history, the liberal icons, people like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, mark the Indians for extinction. I mean, they see them as inferior. They send troops out to attack Indians. They will make unequal treaties with them. They will send alcohol to them and so forth to try to get them drunk. So Indian removal really is crucial to this American sense of expansion from the earliest days. The Pequot War, 1637, when the Puritans go in and just wipe out Pequot villages, and they're quite unrepentant about it. They're bragging. God wanted them to do it. So this is clearly a trademark of American foreign policy. It's kind of ironic by the time you get to Vietnam, when Americans are forced to kind of operate in the countryside, they will refer to it as Indian country. This is a term you see throughout American wars, Indian country. You know, kind of the back areas, the exterior, the frontier. So these things, you know, kind of have longevity. They kind of are reapplied time and again to different areas. So Indian removal is clearly a key component in this initial attempt at expansion. Okay? Slavery is a key component. We don't usually see it that way, but slavery is really central to expansionism. One of the main reasons the United States in the 17th, 18th, especially the 18th and 19th centuries tries to expand, does expand, is to extend areas where slavery will be allowed and where agricultural products can be grown. Why is agriculture important? Because that's America's main export. Most production is small scale and is subsistence. Most farming is still subsistence, but in big plantations where slaves are used to provide labor, you have a surplus there which is marked for export. Okay? America's entry into the global capitalist market is conditioned by the continued growth of slavery, the continued expansion of slavery. And more territory should be acquired as a result of that. Texas, California, well, California becomes a free state, but Texas especially, areas taken from Mexico, attempts to take over places like Cuba and Nicaragua. This idea that slavery needs to constantly expand, agriculture needs to expand because this is a major export commodity. Okay? You start to see the initial American statement on that, on its role in the world in the early 1800s, and probably the key document in this is the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was written by the Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, for this President James Monroe. The Monroe Doctrine specifically says that European countries need to stay out of the New World. Okay? Why did John Quincy Adams write this? Why did Monroe issue it? Couple reasons. One, up in the Northwest, in the Oregon Territory, the Russians had an interest in that part of the world. The ports along the Pacific were quite valuable. They would give one access to the Pacific, ultimately trade with Asia. So the Russians were looking at Oregon. More importantly, in the South, remember Spain had colonized Latin America. Well, what happens in the early 1800s to the Spanish Empire? So you have a lot of Latin Americanists in here. It's falling apart. Throughout the early 1800s, Latin America is swept away by a series of independence movements, Simón Bolívar. So, you know, these countries fall one by one. And pretty soon, where Spain used to be in control of Mexico and Chile and Argentina and so on and so forth, all they have left by the 1820s is Cuba. The Spanish Empire has fallen apart. All these countries are independent now. So John Quincy Adams looks south, and he's afraid that these independent countries will become targeted by Europeans, especially the British. He's afraid Britain will try to come into the New World and take over, replace the Spanish. Does John Quincy Adams want the British coming into South America? Of course not. So he basically says, we have to keep you out. You can't do that to these people. Only we can do that to these people. Okay? Can't do that to those pledges. Only we can do that to our pledges, right? So this is his idea. So he issues the Monroe Doctrine, which says, hands off. You other European powers, stay out. You are not allowed in the New World. You cannot intervene. You cannot colonize. We won't do it to you. You don't do it to us. Right? John Quincy Adams believes in kind of a Pan-Americanism, that there's a common link between the United States and these South American countries. But basically what John Quincy Adams is saying is that we should have hegemony in this region. Other countries should stay out. This is the first time the United States really asserts itself and says, we have specific expansionist goals and we do not want you coming in. Now, the United States also talks about free trade and access to goods and markets and so forth. So on one hand, it's saying, well, free trade in the rest of the world, access to markets and goods and things like that in the rest of the world, but not in our backyard. So it wants to protect a particular region where it has hegemony, and it wants the rest of the world to be open because it doesn't have that same kind of power. So it's anti-colonial everywhere but where it has a colony, essentially. Okay? So this is one of the first indications of American assertiveness. And again, this is something throughout the 50s and 60s when you get into the Vietnam era that's going to be evident again. There's also a missionary aspect to this, and there's no better example than the Manifest Destiny era of the 1840s with regard to Oregon, Texas, and then Latin America. What's Manifest Destiny? What's Manifest Destiny? You've all had survey history courses. Okay, Manifest Destiny. Well, it's a movement toward the West, but even more than that, it's an idea. It's an ideology. Manifest Destiny says that it is the Americans' destiny to take over these lands, to expand. I mean, it's more than when something's your destiny, do you sit around and think about how to do it? I mean, it's your destiny. You don't have to think about it. You have to do it. It's your manifest destiny is to expand. It's to take over these lands where there are people who are red or yellow or brown. So there's a racial component to it as well. It's aggressive. You know, it's our right. In fact, we have a duty to do it. We have to bring Christianity and civilization to these people. It's amazing, but advocates of Manifest Destiny include people like Walt Whitman and Ralph Waldo Emerson, people who, transcendentalists who you normally wouldn't associate with this kind of an aggressive imperial ethic, will actually say, what's Mexico ever done for civilization? It's miserable, it's inefficient. We need to take it over. It's our God-given duty to bring white Christian civilization to the rest of the world. They'll thank us for it. I mean, it hurts me more than it hurts you, but in the long run, this is for your own good. Okay? These Mexicans don't know how to run their own country. You can't let them do that. Indians, I mean, come on. They don't dress like us. They don't talk like us. They don't own property like us. You can't let them run their own lives. We need to come in and show them how to do it. So Manifest Destiny is aggressive. It's saying we have to take over these other areas. It's our duty to do so. As a result, the United States takes over Oregon, 54-40 fight. Okay? It essentially forces the British to cede Oregon to the Americans. The best example, of course, is right here, Texas, where Mexico had become independent. Mexico had borders far north, which encompassed Texas. A group of settlers go into Texas with slaves. The Mexicans dispute Texas's claim to independence, which leads to conflicts and skirmishes, the Alamo and Goliad and places like that, San Jacinto, and ultimately a major war is fought. Okay? One of the key aspects, too, of the Texas War, of the Mexican-American War, was slavery. One reason that it took so long for Texas to get admitted into the Union was that Northerners, who normally would have loved to see America expand, did not want another slave state coming in. Clearly, Texas is going to be a slave state, big plantations and so forth. So this is also part of the expansion of slavery. Okay? It's missionary aspect and economics tied together, and that's usually the case. You can't really separate the two. Right? The filibusters are a good example. Filibusters aren't very well known, but in the 1950s, essentially private armies were often thrown together called filibuster armies. The best known filibusters were Narcisco Lopez, a guy who went to Cuba and tried to take it over, and William Walker tried to take over Nicaragua. These guys would put private armies together. They would then invade and attack. Narcisco Lopez tried to invade Cuba. It was kind of like the Bay of Pigs 100 years earlier. He was stopped short. He promised men who would fight with him, what was it, tobacco, drink, plunder, and women, I think. If you join, you'll get all that, and we'll give you land in Cuba. And of course, the Cubans, repelled them, beat them back. William Walker had more luck. He took over Nicaragua, actually enslaved the entire country for a time until his soldiers went too far, and the Nicaraguans eventually rebelled against Walker. But the filibusters, I mean, in a sense, they're a footnote, but they're important because these guys on their own could not have put together armies and invaded other countries. Who's bankrolling them? Southern planters and bankers who were involved in the cotton market are bankrolling them. Why? Because Cuba would be great. I mean, there's already plantations there, right? Sugar plantations. We can extend the slave empire further south. Americans always want Cuba. Nicaragua, the same way. Southern planters are bankrolling William Walker. So this is part of this expansion too. It's aggressive. Okay? It's a way of saying, we have a right to this area, to these territories. And this is part of our manifest destiny. We need markets there. We want to invest there. We want production from there. And it's our mission to go there to teach these people how to be more like us as part of our ideology. Manifest destiny is really the national ideology. Also, and this is particularly relevant with regard to Vietnam, the United States also begins looking eastward in the 19th century, specifically, of course, to Japan and China. The United States first gets interested in China during the famous Opium Wars of the 1840s. The British control the world opium market, and they essentially forced the Chinese to allow British opium into the country. And in a very short period of time, China has a massive, massive, massive public health crisis with millions of opium addicts. And so the Chinese begin a major, like the United States cigarette campaign, a major anti-opium campaign. And the British don't like this, so they actually go to war against China to force the Chinese to keep their markets open to opium. Now, what's the United States do? John Quincy Adams, he's a good guy. You've seen Amistad. He's against slavery, right? He's one of the good ones. John Quincy Adams says that China is violating the Christian principle. He says opium's bad, but more importantly, China is violating the Christian principle. Is China Christian? No. So that didn't mean a whole lot to them. But John Quincy Adams says China is violating the Christian principle of free trade. Okay? Free trade is more important than this public health. Opium's bad, sure, but what's more important is they're not letting us trade with them. So the British go in. John Quincy Adams supports the British in the Opium War. Britain forces China, as a result of the Opium War, to give it Hong Kong and also to open up all these treaty ports, which essentially give the British the right to trade freely and to dominate these treaty ports in China. The United States goes in and demands something that today we would call most favored nation status. When another country gets a particular deal on tariffs, and a third country comes in and says, I want the same deal, that's called most favored nation status. If I give you no tariffs, then you'll come and say, I want most favored nation status. I'll give you no tariffs too. The British had a different term for it. They called it jackal diplomacy. Basically, a jackal eats what's left after other predators take care of a carcass. And the British are saying the Americans are just jackals. They're just coming in and eating the remains of what we've already done. But clearly, the U.S. has shown it has a deep interest in Asia. Why? China. Why? What's so important about China? It's got a bunch of people in it who can buy stuff. Right, exactly. The China market is going to be crucial. And when Vietnam comes around in the 40s and 50s and 60s, the China market's still there. Okay? And Vietnam is cutting into that. Right? So the American interest in China from the 1840s on is really crucial, and it speaks to the exact same issues that are going to lead the U.S. into Vietnam. Japan's also important at this time. The first American warships, Commodore Perry, attack in the 1850s, again trying to open these markets for American commerce and to bring the American mission to Asia. Right? So by the mid-19th century, the United States clearly has an expansive ideology. It's looking for markets. It's looking for, well, first continentally, it's eliminating the Indians, trying to extend the slave empire, looking for markets internally, looking for areas for agriculture, for plantations, and so forth. You've heard of the famous Trail of Tears, where all the Cherokee are removed from the southeast, Andrew Johnson. The key aspect of that was that once the Cherokee were removed, most of the Cherokee lands were put into use for cotton cultivation. Ex-Cherokee lands became huge cotton plantations, which of course became the major export commodity in 19th century America. That was the keystone to the Southern economy and to the American export economy, cotton. All right? And that comes out of Indian removal. So all these things are connected together, and China and Japan extraterritorially are. I mean, you have continentally and then globally, and they're part of that. Okay? Anybody have any questions on this stuff? All right.
I don't have a question, but I was just going to make the comment that one of the things they talked about, I think it was Andrew Johnson, said that if we could get Texas cotton, then we could bring the rest of the world markets to our knees, because then they would control the majority of the cotton trade.
Yeah.
So,
and in fact,
during
the Civil War, the Confederacy thought that the one thing that would gain independence and keep it going was that. They believe that, remember, the Industrial Revolution occurs in what industry? Textiles, okay? And what's the raw material for textiles? Cotton, right? So the Confederacy believes that the British and French textile industry will buckle if they don't have access to Southern cotton, okay? This is what they believe is going to get them independence and power. It doesn't work, because what happens? Egypt and India get developed. The cotton markets of Egypt and India. But you're right, I mean, that was the belief. If we could develop this cotton industry and all the way into Texas, which is huge, then we can eliminate, basically all our competition. They didn't count on the Egyptian and Indian markets becoming so strong. But that was the attitude of the Confederates, and they believed that was what would win the Civil War for them. King Cotton diplomacy, they called it. They started boycotting. They refused to sell to the Europeans. There's cotton. I mean, a lot of the docks are just full of cotton, just sitting there going to waste. Didn't work, though. The Europeans were able to withstand the embargoes from the Americans and develop their own industries. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, these all tie in together. Okay, and these attitudes continue until the 20th century. At the turn of the century, the turn of the 19th century, you have the first formal imperialist venture. The United States becomes the new empire, and it establishes a principle which is going to be crucial throughout the 20th century into the Vietnam era: the open door. All right. One of the key elements in American foreign policy, American expansionism at the turn of the century, is going to be an economic problem of overproduction and deflation. Technology had advanced so rapidly after World War II, after the Civil War. It did after World War II as well, which is something I'm going to say later. It's actually a parallel situation. Technology and mechanization had advanced so rapidly after the Civil War that in both manufacturing and agriculture, production was way up. Farmers and factories were producing far more goods than the domestic market could use. Production way outpaced consumption. Right? Now, this leads to one of the most intense periods of social crisis in U.S. history. From the 1870s to the 1890s, you have labor struggles are constant. The famous railroad strike, Haymarket, Homestead, Pullman. I mean, the American working class never has a period of sustained protests, national strikes, and violence, a period of intense class consciousness like it does in the late 1800s. This terrifies the capitalist elite because, we don't want these workers going out on strike, and we have to call the National Guard in to suppress them and whatnot. So you have this massive labor unrest. You have unrest on the farms, the Grange movement, the populist movement. These farmers are furious. They're running for office, and throughout the West and South, a lot of populists are being elected, and they have a different political agenda than Wall Street does. In fact, they see Wall Street as the problem. They see Wall Street as, it's a class-based rural movement, and the populists scare the hell out of people too, because blacks and whites are working together in it. So there's kind of a sense of racial harmony in the populist movement as well. And that terrifies people. You have movements of the unemployed. Jacob Coxey, Coxey's Army, unemployed workers marching on Washington. Richard Olney, the Attorney General, says that our founding fathers went too far with their notions of democracy. Popular government, we need less popular government, more law and order. That's essentially what Olney says. Jay Gould, famous financier, railroad owner, says that he's afraid that a great social revolution is about to begin. Workers, if you have too much production, if you have too many goods in circulation, what's that going to do to prices? They're going to plummet. What's that going to do to wages? They're going to plummet, all right? So what do you need to do? Well, there are many different solutions bandied about, but unless you can find some way, you can either quit producing so much, but how does that solve the problem? It doesn't. So what you need to do is find new consumers, right? You have to find consumption. Well, you can't do that internally. Most of the country is just not developed enough to do that. So where do you find new places to get rid of the stuff you already have? Abroad. You look for foreign solutions to these problems of overproduction. Exports becomes the key. So in the 1890s, the U.S. consciously begins to seek foreign markets. John Rockefeller said something along the lines of, the key is to seek foreign exports, to seek foreign markets. There's a guy, an advisor to Andrew Carnegie and J.P. Morgan and others. His name was Charles Conant. And Conant said that the key problem is surplus capital. Surplus capital basically means that there's too much money that's not being used for productive development. In capitalist theory, you take your dividends, you put them back in, and you retool and expand and so forth. Well, if in the 1890s you have all these profits, you're Carnegie or Morgan or whoever, you have tons of profits, right? What's the point of reinvest? Are you going to reinvest them for more production? No, because you can't get rid of what you already have. So Charles Conant is saying, what we have our problem, the problem with the economy, the depression, 1870s, 80s, 90s, full of depression as well as labor unrest and everything else. Problem is surplus capital. These wealthy guys have too much money and they're not doing anything with it. They're stuffing it in their mattress. So we need to find new markets. We need to find new places for investment, for economic concessions and so forth. This leads to the wars, plural, of 1898. Okay? Cuba. The United States has always wanted Cuba. And they have the perfect reason in 1898, throughout the 1890s, because the Spanish are horrific. Spain is a terrible empire. They're treating the Cubans miserably. And so the American media jumps on this and they start writing these stories about how evil the Spanish are, and they turn this into a humanitarian crusade. And so the Americans begin supporting the Cuban people. In Hawaii, the United States has always had a foothold there because of the sugar industry. White missionaries, the missionary thing, go to Hawaii at the turn of the century in the early 1800s, and they stay there and soon dominate the sugar industry. 1893, a new monarch comes to power in Hawaii, Queen Liliuokalani, who's a nationalist. She doesn't like her country being run by this minority of white sugar planters. Okay? So what's the U.S. do? A minister calls the Marines ashore and they overthrow her in 1893. All right? 1898 then, the United States goes to war, defeats the Spanish easily, takes over Cuba, decides at that point to annex Hawaii as well, and for good measure takes over the Philippines. How do they come into this? Because they're also owned by the Spanish who own Cuba. So in one fell swoop, the U.S. takes over Cuba, an area to the south which it's always wanted. It takes over Hawaii and the Philippines. And why are they so important? Because where are they located? Asia, in the Pacific. I mean, they are way stations. If you're eventually going to make it, what's the real dream of Asia? It's China, the China market. But to get to the China market, you can stop at Hawaii. They get Pearl Harbor at this time, and the Philippines too, which is actually colonized. Interesting thing too about the Philippines, kind of a prelude to Vietnam, and the textbooks don't cover this that well. The Philippines immediately began to resist American rule in 1898, and for the next 10 or 12 years there was a rebellion led by Emiliano Aguinaldo, kind of a George Washington figure. The American Marines fought these Filipino insurgents for over a decade. 10,000 Marines were killed and over 100,000 Filipinos were killed until the revolt was suppressed in 1910. Aguinaldo, I believe, was captured and beheaded. So, and actually people, during the Vietnam War, people said, oh, it's like the Philippines, and they started kind of resurfacing. But this is all part of it. Asia was always crucial to America. And the United States had good economic relations with Europe, but it was always going to be a bit more of an equal partnership. The U.S. could not dominate Europe. The British and French and German economies were quite strong on their own, and the United States could deal with them as a partner, clearly in many ways as a senior partner, but it could not come in and dominate those areas. So Asia becomes the solution, the dream of American businessmen and politicians, because in Asia there's an open market. Nobody really controls it, even though you have the British have Hong Kong and the Germans have Qingdao and the Russians have Port Arthur and whatnot. There's no real control there. As a result of that, the Americans look around and they decide that they need to get into Asia, but they cannot do it the way the Europeans have. I mean, the French just go into Vietnam and establish a colony, right? They send the gunboats in and they take over. They send French administrators in, and with Vietnamese collaborators, they create French Indochina. The U.S. doesn't want to do it that way. It doesn't have the same history in Asia that the Europeans do. So the United States decides to do it differently. It's going to create an open door empire, okay? And the open door, in many ways, becomes the key to understanding American foreign policy in the 20th century. It is a crucial concept, but a fairly simple one, luckily. It actually emerges out of the open door notes. The Secretary of State in 1901, John Hay, who I believe had been Lincoln's personal secretary, is that right? I think Hay had been Lincoln's secretary during the Civil War. John Hay is Secretary of State now, and he sends notes to the major European capitals, London, Paris, Berlin, and so on, saying that in China there should be an open door for trade and investment. Nobody should have primary influence in China. Nobody should control China. There should be an open door for trade. An open door, meaning no barriers to it. Now, why would Hay want an open door in China? Because the United States doesn't have the same pull in China that these other countries do. That's what I said before. Is Hay saying that there should be an open door in Latin America? No. Okay, no one's talking about that. What he wants is an open door in China because the U.S. doesn't have a role in China. The Europeans get this, and they essentially throw it in the garbage can. I mean, Hay can't enforce this. The U.S. doesn't have the power to enforce it. But at the same time, this quest for the open door is really going to be crucial to American diplomacy. And you're going to see this throughout, then, the rest of the 20th century, the open door. Look at Bill Clinton in China. What's he trying to do there? I mean, isn't that a more sophisticated approach to developing an open door? The U.S. still has these visions of the China market, which is why when people talk about human rights in China, that's not going anywhere because trade in China far outweighs human rights concerns. Right? It's the open door. It's the same thing that's been going on. Push down.
He's now it seems like they're going after Africa and trying to spread their market there.
Oh, there's actually a new NAFTA for Africa, which is making its way through. It's NAFTA, European Union, all these things. Yeah, they're part of it. It's an open door, and I mean, obviously the markets are shrinking. They're not as available as they once were. So you have to find new ways to get at them. But clearly, I think this is a good way of understanding it. When it comes to Vietnam, you can put it within that context. As I said, economically, Vietnam is not terribly important. The U.S. didn't know where it was, and the U.S. could have survived just fine without any influence in Vietnam at all. A communist Vietnam does not affect the American economy even by a ripple. It means nothing to it. But in the larger picture, in terms of credibility and the open door and creating an environment in Asia which makes it safe for American capital and American investment, yeah, it's more important that way. But I mean, in real terms, Vietnam economically doesn't really mean anything. Right? So you start to see this then at the turn of the century, the open door. And that's going to be really part of the American quest for power and control and profit throughout the 20th century. And you start to see this during the Great War, World War I. Why did World War I get started? I mean, traditionally we hear about, the Balkans and ethnic conflicts and things, and all those things are true. But World War I also was the culmination of an imperialist frenzy from the 1890s through the early 1900s. The major powers had been carving up the world. So you have the British and Dutch fighting the Boer War. You have France and Britain almost coming to blows over the Sudan, the race to Fashoda. It's a period in which the major powers are undergoing the same problems that the United States had in the 1890s, overproduction at home. You need to find new markets. Well, pretty soon, everybody's looking for the same markets, and major power conflict basically becomes inevitable. Right? The best theorist of this actually is Vladimir Lenin in Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, where he analyzes this situation. You can disagree with everything Lenin said, but basically when he looked at Europe, he basically figured out what was going on there. These major powers are all looking for markets, they're looking for areas to invest, and they're coming into conflict with one another. And so by the early 1910s, some kind of conflict is inevitable, and the Balkans becomes a powder keg for it. But I mean, the conflict had been going on for 20 years. It didn't just suddenly happen when the Archduke was killed one day and people said, oh, let's go to war. I mean, this thing had been brewing for some time. These major empires are in conflict, okay? And so the United States sees an opportunity in that. If it can enter the war, make sure the British win, because nobody wants Germany to win, then the United States can have a major role to play in the post-war era. In addition to that, the U.S. bankrolls World War I. Militarily, the U.S. had a fairly limited role to play, but without American capital, the British were in deep trouble. The United States bankrolled Britain. The United States went into World War I as a debtor nation. It came out as a $20 billion creditor. The center of world finance was essentially transplanted from London to New York as a result of World War I. So the United States now has some teeth to put into this open door world. At the same time, something else is going to be real important with regard to Vietnam. The specter of revolution emerges out of World War I. Where? Bolshevik Russia. The first communist revolution occurs in Russia in 1917. It becomes the Soviet Union. What's the U.S. policy toward Bolshevism and toward communist revolution from the outset? It doesn't like it. In fact, the U.S. actually intervenes. It sends troops in to try to overthrow the Bolsheviks. So the United States then is on this dual track. On one hand, maintain the open door. On the other hand, keep revolutionaries suppressed. And you get to the 1950s, 1960s, you talk about Vietnam, and those two things are going to be front and center. Okay? This continues then through World War II and into the Cold War. The United States, as a result of World War II and the Cold War, really does establish global power, global hegemony. The end of World War II, the major Western powers are in disarray. The French, as I said before, have been discredited. The French lost, they're kicked out they're kicked out, they're defeated. They established this collaborationist government in Vichy. The British infrastructure is wiped out. The British go deeply into debt to the United States during the war. I mean, as a condition for aid, the United States forces Britain essentially to abandon the sterling preference trading system with its own, kind of closed trading system to open up the world. This is part of the open door. And the United States directs its attacks not just at enemies in the communist camp, and in fact, they're not really the problem because they're weak. The real problem is the British, because the British have something called the imperial preference system, in which the British Empire gets to trade internally based on the pound sterling. And the United States really can't compete in those markets. So when the British say, we need help against the Nazis, the U.S. says, sure, we'll help you, but you open up the empire. All right? You remove the imperial preference system. And in fact, in 1944 at Bretton Woods, they created a new world economic system based upon not the pound sterling, but upon the U.S. dollar and the gold standard. Okay? The open door writ large. So the United States establishes global hegemony both because it emerges from World War II as the only country which doesn't take huge, huge, huge hits. The Soviet Union loses 25 to 30 million people, and the country's devastated in World War II. Germany, of course, is wiped out in World War II. Japan, wiped out in World War II. Britain and France suffered deeply in World War II. The United States economy improves. I mean, that's what ends the Depression, right? So the U.S. comes out of World War II as the only country militarily and economically in much better shape than it went into the war. So it emerges as the global power. What's the other aspect? It's the U.S.-Soviet rivalry. The only country which can challenge the U.S., and it can challenge it politically, but not militarily, is the Soviet Union. Despite all these kind of alarmist reports at the time, the Soviet Union militarily was never anywhere as strong as the U.S. was. I mean, militarily, the United States dominated. In addition to that, what does the U.S. have that the Soviet Union doesn't have? The bomb, right. The bomb, yeah. So the U.S. clearly has control. But the United States tends to see the Soviet Union as with reason, as a country that wants to expand its own influence. So it believes the Soviet Union is involved all over the world. Whenever somebody's causing trouble, they figure the Soviet Union's behind it. So if Ho Chi Minh wants the French out of Indochina, it must be because Stalin's telling him that. He could never want that on his own, right? Okay? So the U.S.-Soviet rivalry is quite important here. But with regard to Vietnam, even more important after October 1st, 1949, is the Chinese challenge. What happens on October 1st, 1949? The revolution. Mao Zedong of the Chinese Communist Party wins the Civil War and proclaims the People's Republic of China. The world's biggest country, the China market, is now communist. Americans used to say, just think if everyone in China bought one bottle of Coke every day, the money we'd make. If we'd sell one McDonald's hamburger to them every day, just think of how much profit there is to be made there. October 1st, 1949, it's not going to happen. Mao Zedong and the communists come to power. The U.S., I mean, the British immediately recognize Mao, but the U.S. doesn't, right? The United States rejects that. They pursue a path in Asia, as they did in Europe, of containment. Containment means you keep a problem isolated and contained. You may not necessarily have to do away with it altogether, but you contain it. You do not let it spread. In Europe, containment means you do not allow communism to move beyond Eastern Europe, where the Soviet Red Army has stayed after World War II. It doesn't retreat back to its homeland. Stalin keeps Red Army troops in the countries of Eastern Europe, and that area, that entire region, becomes communist. Containment means you don't allow the Soviet Union's influence or communism's influence to spread beyond that into places like Britain or France or Greece or wherever. Okay? And as a result, you get things like the Truman Doctrine, yeah.
Well, is there any real evidence for their expansionist ideology that, you know, I mean, that's always been the retort from the Western countries of continuing expansionism, but is there any real hard evidence that was in their documentation?
After World War II?
Yeah, that the communist expansion was really...
Stalin would always say, the Soviet justification was defensive. We've been attacked in 1914 and 1941 by the Germans. Poland has traditionally been a corridor through which other countries have attacked us, and we are not going to. We've just lost 25 million people. We had millions of farms and factories destroyed. We're not going to let that happen again. So we are going to establish this large buffer of friendly governments so that the next time somebody like Hitler comes out of the woodwork, he's not going to get to the Soviet frontier before somebody challenges him. George Kennan, famous American diplomat who was the architect of containment, didn't see the things Stalin was doing as being unique to communism. He thought this is traditionally the way Russians acted. They were kind of insular and they were concerned with their own borders. I mean, this would be, in the 1960s, the New Left argument, that the Soviet Union, in fact, in some areas, retreated immediately. In Iran, in 1946, the Soviet Union was challenged by the United States, immediately retreated. Actually, Stalin and Churchill made a deal in 1944 on the Balkans over who would have influence where, and the British were given primary influence in Greece. Now, inside Greece, the Greek Communist Party was rebelling against the fascist government. Stalin wouldn't help them. I mean, as far as the Greek communists were concerned, Stalin sold them out, but that was the deal he made with Churchill. I mean, one can make a good case that Stalin, by no means was he a kind man. I mean, everybody despised him, but local communists often ran afoul of him, like Ho Chi Minh had, because he would sell them down the river. So again, I mean, that's a subjective thing, but Soviet adventurism, I mean, if you look at what they did, I mean, they basically got into Eastern Europe, but from that point on, they never tried militarily to influence other areas. They might do it politically, they might support dissident groups in other areas, but in some areas, like in Iran or in Greece, they withdrew altogether. And I mean, it didn't really do much in Latin America until the Cuban Missile Crisis. So again, I mean, I think that you can make a good case that there really was a defensive attitude there.
I was just going to say, if you don't care anything about subtleties, which a lot of U.S. policymakers did not, if you're just keeping a scorecard, it looks as though communism is spreading, though. The Soviet Union, China falls in 49, Ho's stomping around in Vietnam, so it certainly appears as though it's spreading, even though their relations are not so.
Well, yeah, that's really the key point. I mean, the United States sees China as another one in the Soviet scorecard, and when in fact, Stalin supported Chiang Kai-shek in the 1940s. I mean, he infuriated Mao Zedong at Potsdam when he said, "Yeah, Chiang, the KMT is the government in China. We'll support them," and he infuriated Mao Zedong. I mean, Mao and Stalin, I mean, there was a relationship out of convenience, but they were never close. And of course, in 1959, there's an open break, and they almost go to war against each other in the 1960s. But you're right, the U.S. doesn't have a sense of subtlety or nuance there.
Also, looking at it from the economic argument, the South Vietnamese ambassador, I don't want to try to pronounce his name, he makes the point that they saw Vietnam as a link between China and Indonesia, where there really was a larger economic interest.
That's what Japan did. That's why Japan went in. It wasn't really for Vietnam. It was for Indonesia, which has oil. Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think that talks to that whole idea of the open door in Asia, not necessarily Vietnam, but in Asia generally. That's why containment in Asia becomes so important. China's bad enough. I mean, China fell, that's bad. But we can't let this go beyond China, which is why in Korea they make a stand, even though Korea is really maybe less important than Vietnam is. So, Vietnam is tied into all of these things, the Cold War, hegemony, markets, containment, and so forth. Next time, I guess we'll shift back and we'll actually talk about the Americans in Vietnam. I think we've gotten to the point now where we've done background on Vietnam, on the United States up to 1945, and we can see, how they interact actually. All right, so we'll start that next time.